Hi guys, tonight we step into the freezing world of the Arctic convoys, a story that carried not only supplies but also the heavy weight of survival. These were journeys where sailors faced icy storms, relentless U-boats, and the constant fear of never seeing home again. It was one of the harshest duties in the Royal Navy, a lifeline to an ally, but also a slow march through some of the most hostile waters on Earth. In this first part, we will begin calmly, setting the scene of what these convoys were, why they mattered, and what kind of men sailed on them. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. The story of the Arctic convoys begins with geography, because geography was the enemy as much as the German war machine. Britain had committed to helping the Soviet Union after the German invasion in 1941, and the only practical route was by sea across the North Atlantic, around the top of Norway, and into ports like Murmansk and Archangel. On a map, the distance might not seem long, but for those who sailed it, this was a voyage into an endless night of cold and danger. The convoys were organised into groups of merchant ships carrying weapons, fuel, food and machinery. To protect them, destroyers, cruisers, and even battleships of the Royal Navy were assigned as escorts. Each man aboard knew that once they turned north, the weather itself became a greater threat than gunfire. Storms swept down from the Arctic without warning, whipping the sea into walls of black water. Temperatures dropped so low that ice formed instantly on decks, railings and rigging. A ship could become top-heavy with ice, threatening to capsize if the crew could not chop it away fast enough. Imagine a sailor on watch, his eyelashes frozen, his hands aching inside gloves, trying to keep his balance on a deck coated in ice as waves slammed over the bow. This was not a place for glory, but for endurance. The Arctic convoys mattered because they carried life to the Eastern Front. Soviet armies needed tanks, trucks, planes and ammunition, and without these shipments the fight against Germany might falter. Churchill himself described the route as the worst journey in the world. That phrase was no exaggeration. A convoy might take weeks to reach its destination, creeping slowly through seas patrolled by German submarines, aircraft and surface raiders. Every mile forward was uncertain. The sailors learned to live with the awareness that death could come at any moment. And yet, despite the danger, men volunteered. Some joined because duty demanded it, others because they wanted to stand against the darkness that had swept across Europe. For many it was simply their assignment, orders given and accepted. But once aboard, every man understood he was part of something larger than himself, something that reached across oceans and continents. As we settle into this story, picture a convoy gathering in a northern port. Merchant ships, grey and weathered, loaded with crates, barrels and tanks chained to their decks. Royal Navy warships nearby, their crews checking weapons, preparing depth charges, scanning the skies. The air is sharp, biting the skin. A quiet tension runs through the harbour, because everyone knows what lies ahead. In the distance, seagulls circle lazily, unaware of the fear held in human hearts. The sailors smoke their last cigarettes on dry land, share a final laugh, or simply stare into the horizon. Soon, the signal will come, and the convoy will move out into the open sea, into the unknown. This is where our journey begins, with men who accepted the harshest duty, sailing toward the Arctic with resolve and quiet courage, carrying not only supplies but also the fragile hope of victory. The departure of a convoy was always a moment both ordinary and extraordinary. On the surface it looked simple enough. Ships leaving harbour, smoke rising from their funnels, a line of grey hulls slowly edging toward the horizon. Yet beneath that quiet routine lay a knowledge that once the shoreline faded, there would be no turning back. The sailors knew that the next land they might see could be Norway's frozen mountains, the icebound harbours of Murmansk, or perhaps nothing at all. The Royal Navy escorts led the way, destroyers sliding through the water like watchful guardians, while the heavier cruisers and sometimes even a battleship took position at the flanks. Around them, the merchant ships kept tight formation, each carrying its hidden cargo of war. Tanks lashed to decks, crates of aircraft engines, barrels of fuel stacked in rows. Every sailor, whether in uniform or merchant's overalls, understood that the cargo mattered as much as their own lives. The convoys were lifelines, and without them the Eastern Front could starve of weapons and food. The Arctic seemed to resent this intrusion. Almost immediately the weather turned against them. Wind whipped across the decks with a sharpness that cut through coats and scarves. Spray froze as it landed, turning rails and ladders into slick traps. The sea itself felt alive, rising in black swells that crashed over bows and swept across decks, leaving sailors clinging to ropes or crouching low to keep from being washed away. The sound of the wind was a constant howl, broken only by the groan of the ship's hull and the sharp crack of ice forming where steel met air. Nights stretched longer than days, especially in winter, when darkness wrapped the convoy in hours of uneasy silence. Men on watch stared into that blackness, eyes straining for the faint silhouette of a periscope or the sudden flash of an aircraft's searchlight. They drank scalding tea from tin mugs, letting the heat anchor them in a world where cold crept into bones no matter how many layers they wore. Fatigue settled quickly, but no one dared relax. Beneath those waves, German U-boats prowled, listening, waiting. In the sky above, long-range bombers lurked on bases in northern Norway, ready to swoop down the moment weather cleared. Every sailor carried that awareness in the back of his mind. The enemy was out there, unseen but real. Yet for the moment, in these early days of the voyage, the greater enemy was the Arctic itself. Sailors hacked at ice with axes, their arms numb, boots slipping as they tried to keep the ship from becoming dangerously heavy. It was brutal work, and sometimes the ice seemed to form faster than it could be removed. Fingers cracked, faces bled from windburn, and still the task went on, hour after hour. There was no choice. To stop was to risk the ship, and the convoy could not afford to lose even one vessel to nature's grip. Life aboard settled into a rhythm of watches, meals, and endless vigilance. A meal might be little more than hard biscuits, salted meat, or watery stew, eaten quickly before the next roll of the ship threatened to spill it. Sleep was brief, broken by alarms or simply the cold that seeped through blankets. In the mess rooms, men talked quietly, sometimes about home, sometimes about nothing at all. Jokes were told, though laughter was often short, fading quickly into the hum of engines and the distant crash of waves. Still, those small moments mattered. A joke, a song hummed under the breath, or a shared cigarette on deck. These were the things that kept despair at bay. What struck many sailors most was the vast emptiness around them. Days could pass without sighting another vessel beyond their own convoy. The ocean seemed endless, a rolling wilderness of grey and white where time itself felt suspended. The only measure of progress was the slow ticking of the compass and the cautious advance on charts. Every mile forward was earned through endurance. And yet, within that emptiness, there was also a strange beauty. At times the clouds parted, revealing stars sharp and cold above. Northern lights sometimes shimmered across the sky, ghostly green curtains that rippled in silence over the frozen sea. Sailors would pause in their work just for a moment to watch, knowing they were witnessing something few on earth would ever see. It did not erase the fear, but it reminded them that even in such harshness, the world held wonders. The convoy pressed on, bound together not only by steel and orders, but by a shared determination. Each ship relied on the others, each man relied on his mates. Ahead lay greater dangers, submarines, aircraft, surface raiders, but already the Arctic had begun its test. Those who endured the first days learned quickly. This journey was not about heroics. It was about patience, discipline, and the quiet strength to keep moving forward, no matter what the sea or sky might bring. The first week at sea often decided how a man would endure the rest of the voyage. Those who had never sailed into the Arctic quickly learned its cruel lessons. Seasickness struck many at once, leaving sailors pale, exhausted, and unable to eat. There was no kindness from the sea. Whether a man felt steady or broken, the waves crashed on without pause. The convoys moved at the pace of the slowest merchant ship, which meant long hours of ploughing through grey swells with little relief. For the escorts, it was endless vigilance. Destroyers zigzagged constantly, their sonar crews listening for the faintest echo that might signal a submarine. The men down in the engine rooms worked in suffocating heat, sweat pouring despite the icy air outside. Above them, the decks were coated in frost, so cold that metal burned bare skin on contact. This contrast, heat below, freezing misery above, was part of the strange rhythm of life at sea. Every sailor carried private fears. Some feared drowning, others fire, others the thought of freezing to death in black water if their ship went down. Training taught them what to do in theory, how to launch lifeboats, how to abandon ship. But in the Arctic, most knew survival time in the water was measured in minutes. Few liked to speak of it, but everyone thought of it. Still, the convoy pressed forward. A system of signals kept ships aligned. Lamps blinked in the dark, flags waved in rare moments of daylight. Radio silence was strict, for fear of being tracked. Orders passed quickly and quietly, every captain aware that one mistake could scatter the formation. Unity was survival. The monotony of the sea played tricks on the mind. Days blurred together, wake, watch, eat, sleep. Sailors lost track of dates, of how long they had been gone. Letters from home were months behind. Photographs grew worn from constant handling. A photo tucked into a pocket might be taken out a dozen times a day, a reminder of why the hardship was endured. Small comforts mattered more than anyone admitted. A hot drink, a fresh pair of socks, a story told in the dim light of the mess, all became lifelines. Some men wrote diaries, scribbling words in cramped handwriting even as the ship lurched. Others carved small figures from wood or bone, tokens to pass the time and ward off despair. Silence was common too, a silence born not only from fatigue but from respect for the struggle shared. Out on deck the cold was relentless. Ice built in layers so thick that sailors swung hammers and axes for hours, chipping away just to keep the ship stable. Fingers bled, muscles ached, but the work could not stop. If they fell behind, if ice claimed too much weight, the vessel could list and capsize. Every man knew this, and so the rhythm of hammering against ice became as familiar as the roll of the waves. At night the convoy seemed like a ghostly procession. Faint outlines of ships moved through darkness, muffled engines thudding in unison. Sometimes the aurora painted the sky, casting a green glow that made the scene almost unreal. In those moments, the men felt part of something larger than themselves, a vast and unforgiving world where their courage was tested with every breath. Ahead still lay the greater dangers of enemy attack, but already the Arctic had shown its power. For those aboard, survival was no longer abstract. It was an hourly effort, a constant negotiation with cold, fatigue, and fear. And yet the ships kept moving forward, each mile another victory against the endless winter sea. By the time the convoy reached deeper waters, the sense of isolation was complete. Land was gone, replaced by a horizon of grey sea and low clouds that seemed to press down on the ships. The Arctic gave no comfort, only the reminder that these men were sailing through one of the most hostile regions on Earth. Every morning began with the same ritual, checking for ice, clearing it where needed, scanning the skies and the sea. Officers paced decks quietly, their breath turning white in the air while sailors worked with tools stiff from the cold. The smallest tasks became trials. To tie a rope with frozen fingers was an ordeal. To climb a ladder coated in ice carried the risk of slipping into the sea. The danger was not only from the elements, but from the monotony itself. The endless repetition of grey days and black nights gnawed at morale. Sailors fought not to let their minds wander into despair. Some focused on the rhythm of duty, letting the clock of watches and meals structure their thoughts. Others looked for small changes, shifts in the clouds, the colour of the water, even the flight of seabirds. Anything different became an anchor in time. Fatigue was constant. Sleeping quarters were cramped, often damp and always cold. Blankets froze stiff, condensation from breath turning to frost by morning. Yet men found ways to rest. A corner in the mess deck, a hammock that swayed with the sea, even a brief nap between duties was treasured. Noise was ever present. The vibration of engines, the slam of waves, the clang of chains. Sailors grew used to it, though in the silence of their minds they sometimes longed for the quiet of home. Still, there was pride too. Each day without loss felt like a triumph. The convoy was a chain, and every link mattered. Watching the ships ahead and behind, sailors felt the bond of shared purpose. They were not alone, even if the ocean tried to convince them otherwise. From time to time, aircraft patrols were sighted, small specks high above, distant and menacing. The escorts were quick to respond, guns tracking the sky, though more often the planes disappeared back into cloud. Yet the message was clear. The enemy knew they were there. Tension grew with every sighting. For now, the Arctic itself remained the greater challenge, but everyone sensed that the quiet could not last. Winter seas, endless cold and weary bodies had already stripped away illusions. The men knew they were tested not only by what nature delivered, but by the battles waiting beyond the horizon. The Arctic convoys were never routine. Each mile forward demanded courage, and the courage shown was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, quiet, and persistent. An endurance that kept ships moving through waters where survival was never guaranteed. As the days passed, the strain began to show in small ways. Men's faces grew gaunt, their eyes ringed with shadows from sleepless nights. Beards went unshaven, hands cracked and raw from salt and cold, yet still the routine pressed on. Watches rotated, meals were served, orders given. The convoy moved like a living organism, each ship bound to the next by necessity and trust. For the escort crews, tension was constant. Sonar operators sat for hours in dim rooms, headphones pressed tight, listening for the faint metallic echo of a submarine. The silence between pings was heavy, each man aware that somewhere beneath them lurked an enemy. Depth charges were stacked on decks, ready to roll into the sea at a moment's notice. Gunners stayed near their weapons even when off watch, knowing that sudden alarms could come at any time. The merchant sailors lived a different rhythm, but one no less punishing. Their ships were slower, heavier, and far more vulnerable. They carried the supplies that made the whole voyage necessary, and this made them targets. Many of these men were civilians, drawn from ports across Britain and the Commonwealth, yet they faced the same dangers as any warship crew. Some had never held a weapon before, and now found themselves manning anti-aircraft guns in freezing winds. Camaraderie grew from hardship. Sailors shared what little comforts they could. A cigarette passed hand to hand, a scrap of chocolate saved from a ration, a joke muttered through chattering teeth. Music sometimes drifted through mess decks, gramophones turning slowly despite the ship's roll. A song from home could lift spirits, if only for a few minutes. Letters, though rare, were treasured beyond measure. Reading a few lines from a wife, a mother, or a sweetheart brought warmth that even the Arctic could not freeze. Still, no comfort lasted long. The ocean demanded attention. Ice never stopped forming, ropes frayed, machinery strained under the weight of salt and frost. Every man became both sailor and labourer, repairing, chipping, tightening, hauling. The rhythm of survival left little room for thought beyond the next hour. At night, the convoy resembled a trail of shadows across a darkened sea. Only the faint glow of a covered lamp or the shape of a hull against the stars revealed the presence of companions. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet filled with unease. In that darkness, a single torpedo could change everything. The men knew it, though they did not speak of it often. Instead, they carried on, moving ever northward into seas colder, rougher and more dangerous with each passing day. Ahead lay the true tests, the enemy, waiting beyond the veil of storm and night. The first real brush with danger often came without warning. A lookout might spot a shadow on the horizon, a shape that did not belong to the convoy, or a sudden signal from an escort would ripple through the line, engines roaring as ships tightened formation. The men had trained for this, but training never erased the jolt of fear that spread whenever alarm sounded. In the Arctic, sound carried strangely. The thud of distant explosions or the low drone of aircraft engines could feel both near and impossibly far. Sailors would stop what they were doing, eyes lifting to the grey sky, waiting to see if the threat would pass or strike. When enemy planes appeared, it was often sudden. A burst from the clouds, the glint of wings catching pale sunlight. The convoy erupted into motion. Guns swung upward, crews rushed to stations, and the calm monotony of sailing shattered in a heartbeat. Anti-aircraft fire cracked across the decks, tracers stitching lines through the air. The planes swooped low, searching for the slower merchant ships, releasing bombs or torpedoes before vanishing again into cloud. For the men below, the world became chaos. The roar of engines, the hammer of guns, the shouts of orders, all blended with the crash of waves. Smoke trailed across the sea, stinging eyes and choking lungs. And yet, amid that fury, discipline held. Escorts moved to shield the convoy, weaving patterns designed to confuse attackers. Gunners steadied their aim, even as their hands numbed from the cold. The merchants kept their course, captains unwilling to break formation and expose the chain. When the attack ended, silence felt heavier than before. Sailors stood at their posts, hearts racing, ears still ringing, scanning skies now empty again. Sometimes wreckage floated past. A crate, a splintered plank, grim reminders of how close destruction had come. If a ship was lost, the convoy pressed on. There was rarely time to stop for survivors. Every delay meant more danger. It was a truth the men understood but never accepted easily. Still, life returned quickly to routine. Watches resumed, meals were eaten in silence, and the endless battle against ice continued. The Arctic demanded it. There was no pause, no room for grief. The men carried their memories quietly, storing them away like the photographs in their pockets. Another night would fall, another day would dawn, and the convoy would move forward once more. Every attack survived was a reminder of both fragility and resilience. They were still alive, still sailing, still pushing through the frozen sea. Ahead, more dangers waited, and each man knew the journey had only begun. After the first attacks, the men settled into a sharper state of awareness. Every shadow on the horizon was studied, every sound on the wind seemed suspect. The Arctic convoys turned ordinary sailors into men who lived by instinct as much as training. Sleep was shorter, nerves stretched tighter, and still the routine continued. Escorts swept the flanks, sonar teams strained for signs of submarines, and lookouts scanned endlessly across the ice-cold water. Beneath those waters, U-boats moved silently, waiting for the moment to strike. The threat of torpedoes was constant, and sailors lived with the knowledge that steel could rip into their ship at any time. The only warning might be a thin white trail racing across the waves, or no warning at all. Stories spread of ships vanishing in seconds, swallowed by flame and water, leaving behind only smoke and debris. To the men sailing now, those stories were not distant tales, but possibilities with every passing hour. And yet, they carried on. Small rituals grew into anchors of sanity. A sailor might polish a piece of brass the same way each morning, or carve marks into a bit of wood to count the days. Some prayed silently before sleep. Others whispered jokes to themselves, trying to remember what laughter felt like. In the mess, voices were low but steady, conversations drifting between memories of home and guesses about how much longer the voyage might last. The food was plain, often cold before it could be eaten, but it filled empty stomachs. Tea was a treasure, its warmth a reminder that not everything was harsh. Even the simplest mug of it gave men the strength to endure another watch. On deck, the world remained merciless. Waves towered, spray froze, and the wind carved through layers of clothing as if they were nothing. Yet sometimes, In rare moments of calm, the sea seemed almost gentle. The northern lights shimmered across the sky, pale curtains of green and blue swaying in silence. Men paused to watch, awe softening their weary faces. It was beauty in the middle of brutality, a reminder that the world held more than hardship. Such moments passed quickly, but they lingered in memory, giving sailors something bright to carry alongside the fear. The convoy moved on, each ship a fragile piece of a larger whole. Ahead, more tests awaited, storms fiercer than any yet faced, and enemies determined to break the chain. The men could not know what lay ahead, but they knew one truth: they would face it together, bound by duty, endurance, and the unspoken promise that no one sailed this journey alone. The weather soon reminded the men that nature could be as deadly as any enemy. A storm swept down without warning, turning the sea into a heaving wilderness of black water and white foam. Waves rose higher than the masts, crashing over decks with the force of walls collapsing. Ships vanished from sight behind curtains of spray, only to reappear seconds later, battered but still holding formation. Every man clung to ropes, rails, or anything solid as the ships rolled so violently that standing upright became impossible. Below decks, hammocks swung like pendulums, mess tins clattered to the floor, and water forced its way through every seam. The roar of the storm drowned out thought itself. Orders were shouted but lost in the wind, replaced by the instinct of survival. The men on deck hacked at ice with axes, even as waves broke around them, each strike a race against time. Ice grew heavier by the hour, clinging to gun barrels, rigging and ladders, threatening to topple the ships. Sailors swung hammers with frozen hands, their faces raw from windburn, knowing that if they failed, the sea would claim them. In the engine rooms, firemen shoveled coal and oiled machinery in suffocating heat, the sweat pouring from them even as frost thickened outside. Every part of the ship was stretched to its limit, steel groaning with the strain, and yet, despite the chaos, discipline endured. Captains held their courses, trusting in their crews and their escorts. The convoy bent but did not break, ships moving together like battered ghosts through the storm. For hours that felt like days, the men lived on the edge of exhaustion, their bodies numb, their minds drained. When at last the storm eased, silence fell heavy over the fleet. The ocean still rolled, but the violence had lessened. Men slumped where they stood, some too tired even to speak. Damage was inspected, losses counted. If a ship had fallen behind or disappeared into the dark, the grief was quiet, swallowed by the necessity of pressing on. Yet there was also pride. They had endured one of the Arctic's worst tempers and survived. That survival was its own kind of victory, though it came without cheers or celebration. Instead, the men returned to their routines, clearing ice, repairing damage, scanning horizons. In their silence was strength, the kind that grew not from grand speeches but from the simple act of continuing, step by step, mile by mile, through a world determined to break them. The calm after the storm did not bring comfort, only a new kind of unease. Seas lay quieter, the wind gentler, yet the men felt exposed beneath clearer skies. Storms, for all their terror, sometimes shielded them from enemy eyes. Now, with visibility stretched for miles, every man knew they were more vulnerable. Escorts tightened their patrols, destroyers weaving back and forth in restless arcs, sonar pulses echoing into the deep. The merchant ships trudged forward, slower and heavier from the ice still clinging to their decks. Sailors moved carefully, clearing the last of it, muscles aching from days of unbroken labour. In the mess, meals were eaten quickly, talk subdued. The memory of the storm lingered, each man aware of how close the sea had come to swallowing them whole. Sleep remained scarce, broken by sudden alarms or the groan of strained metal. Dreams, when they came, were filled with water, rising, endless, inescapable. And yet, duty left no room for indulgence. Watches resumed their endless cycle, eyes sharp against the horizon. It was during these calmer days that thoughts of home pressed hardest. A photograph tucked in a pocket, a letter folded soft from handling, a tune hummed under breath. Such small tokens grew heavier with meaning. Men spoke of familiar pubs, of warm kitchens, of streets where rain fell softly instead of freezing solid. Those memories were both comfort and burden, keeping spirits alive while reminding them of what they risked losing. Sometimes, in rare moments, the sea revealed another side. At night, the aurora stretched across the sky again, brighter this time, shimmering in silent waves of green and violet. Sailors stood at the rails, breath rising in white clouds, watching in awe. The spectacle silenced even the most hardened among them. For a few minutes the fear of submarines and storms faded, replaced by wonder. Such beauty felt almost cruel, like a reminder that the world beyond war still existed, waiting somewhere far away. Then, just as quickly, the spell ended. Alarms sounded, signalling unidentified aircraft. The men scrambled back to stations, hands cold on steel, eyes scanning the sky. The escorts tightened again, guns elevated, ready. The convoy had entered waters where attacks grew more frequent, and every man sensed it. Nature had tested them with storm and ice. Now, it seemed, the enemy would take his turn. Each heartbeat felt louder than the engines, each breath sharper than the cold air. And still, the ships pressed forward, bound by necessity, bound by courage, bound by the silence of men who knew their lives hung by a thread. The first full-scale air attack came at dawn, when the horizon was little more than a faint line of grey. Lookouts spotted specks in the distance, growing larger with frightening speed. Alarms rang across the convoy, bells clanging, voices shouting. Men who had been half asleep rushed to their guns, fumbling with gloves and helmets, the icy air biting their lungs as they ran. The escorts shifted position at once, destroyers surging ahead, anti-aircraft crews swinging weapons skyward. Soon the drone of engines filled the sky, louder and louder until it seemed the air itself was vibrating. Then came the shadows of aircraft, German bombers sweeping low through broken cloud, their wings glinting in the pale light. The first bursts of fire cracked across the decks, tracers streaking upward, carving jagged paths against the morning. Explosions followed, distant at first, then closer, splashes rising where bombs struck the sea. The convoy kept formation, merchant ships stubbornly holding course despite the chaos above. Captains knew breaking ranks would invite disaster, and so they stayed steady, their crews gripping rails and praying as the bombers dove again. For the gunners, time collapsed into seconds. They fired until their arms shook, smoke choking their lungs, ears ringing from the thunder of their own weapons. The sky filled with streaks of fire, shells bursting among the attackers. A bomber spiraled down in flames, crashing into the sea, but more came behind it, wave after wave, determined to break the line. One merchant ship took a direct hit, fire erupting from its deck. Black smoke curled upward as men scrambled to hoses, trying desperately to contain the flames. Escorts rushed to shield it, their guns pounding, while the rest of the convoy pushed forward through the storm of steel and fire. Minutes stretched into an eternity before the bombers finally turned away, vanishing back into the clouds. Silence returned, broken only by the groan of ships and the cries of wounded men. Smoke still drifted across the convoy, the smell of burning fuel clinging to every breath. The damaged merchant ship limped on, battered but afloat, her crew refusing to yield. The men were shaken, their nerves raw, but there was no time to dwell. Guns were cleaned, ammunition restocked, damage patched where possible. Tomorrow, or even later that same day, the bombers could return, and everyone knew the submarines were still out there, waiting. Courage here was not loud or dramatic. It was the steady act of standing at a gun, of steering a course, of lifting a bucket of water to fight a fire. It was endurance, measured minute by minute in the face of a sky and sea that offered no mercy. The hours after the air raid carried a strange quiet. The sea rolled in slow swells, grey and endless, while smoke from the damaged ship trailed behind like a scar. Men moved with heavy steps, some still trembling from adrenaline, others sunk deep into silence. They cleaned their guns, checked equipment, and patched holes where shrapnel had torn through steel. On the merchant ships, crews laboured to save cargo, dousing smouldering fires with buckets and hoses. The air smelled of oil and burnt wood, reminders of how close destruction had come. In the mess, meals were eaten quickly, conversation hushed. Some men stared into mugs of tea without drinking, their thoughts elsewhere. Others whispered about the next attack, wondering if it would be worse. No one doubted it would come. Even the youngest sailors had already learned that in these waters, danger never rested for long. Yet amid that unease, life pressed on. Watches were stood, engines tended, decks cleared of ice that formed again with each spray of salt water. Fatigue pressed heavily, but duty gave no pause. Hammocks swayed with weary bodies, and when sleep came, it came hard, only to be broken by alarms or the groan of shifting steel. The enemy was not the only threat. Cold seeped into bones, leaving joints stiff, fingers numb, and faces raw. Frostbite was an unspoken fear, as real as torpedoes. Men wrapped rags around boots, stuffed gloves with whatever scraps they could find, and endured. There was no other choice, and still there were moments of humanity. A sailor shared his last cigarette with a mate. Another produced a harmonica, its thin notes trembling against the thrum of engines. Laughter rose briefly at a joke, fragile but real. These small things mattered more than any man admitted, tiny victories against despair. At night, the convoy moved like shadows across the water, barely visible save for the faint glow of covered lamps. The northern lights flickered again, a pale green ribbon twisting across the sky. Men looked up in silence, each lost in private thoughts, some of wonder, some of longing. It was beauty in a place that had none to spare. The escorts kept their patrols, destroyers cutting restless paths, sonar crews leaning forward with tired eyes. Every blip, every echo, every flicker of sound was studied, judged, feared. Because beneath the waves, they all knew, danger lurked. The Arctic had already tested them with storm and fire. The sea had nearly swallowed them, and the sky had struck with fury. What lay below waited still, patient and unseen, ready to remind them that survival was never promised. The first sign of submarines often came at night, when the convoy was wrapped in near-total darkness. Lookouts leaned into the wind, eyes straining against the black sea, searching for the faint trace of a periscope or the shimmer of a torpedo's wake. It was a terrible kind of waiting, the kind that gnawed at nerves more than any storm. Men knew the enemy was out there, moving silently beneath the waves, calculating angles, waiting for the moment to strike. The escorts responded with constant vigilance. Destroyers zigzagged across the convoy's path, their sonar crews listening through headphones, sending out pings that echoed into the deep. The sound was hollow, eerie, like a heartbeat in the ocean. When the echo returned clean, the men relaxed for a breath. When it returned distorted, tension climbed in an instant. Sometimes alarms were sounded for shapes that turned out to be drifting ice. But no one mocked those false calls. Better to be wrong than too late. The first torpedo strike was unforgettable. A muffled boom rolled through the water, followed by a dull shudder that seemed to pass through every ship. Then the cries came. Flares shot skyward, red against the night, signalling distress. One of the merchant ships had been hit, her bow lifting as flames erupted along her deck. Men aboard scrambled for lifeboats, their shouts lost in the roar of fire and sea. The escorts leapt into action, racing toward the source, dropping depth charges that thundered into the depths. The sea shook with explosions, geysers of water rising high, the smell of cordite thick in the air. Below, somewhere unseen, a submarine dodged and turned, hunted like a shadow in the deep. For the convoy, there was no pause. Orders demanded they continue, even as a burning ship slipped beneath the waves. Survivors, if any, faced the cruelest odds. In the Arctic, the sea killed in minutes. Rescue was rare, not for lack of compassion, but for the brutal truth of necessity. To linger was to risk the entire convoy. The men knew this, and the knowledge weighed heavily. Silence returned as the flames faded, leaving only wreckage and the memory of voices. Sailors tightened their coats, gripped the rails, and forced their eyes forward. One ship gone, many left to save. Such was the arithmetic of survival in the Arctic convoys. Harsh, unforgiving, but real. They pressed onward, hearts heavy, knowing the submarines were still out there, waiting for their next chance. The loss of a ship left an emptiness that stretched beyond the gap in formation. Sailors on neighbouring vessels stared at the place where their companion had been, smoke still drifting across the waves. They thought of the men now gone, friends seen only in passing perhaps, but brothers in hardship all the same. The convoy did not slow. It could not. Yet every survivor carried the weight of that silence, a reminder that tomorrow it might be their turn. On the escorts, depth charge crews remained tense, hands raw from handling the heavy drums of explosives. Each drop was followed by a thunder that shook steel and bone alike. Sometimes the sea boiled with fragments of wood or oil, signs that an enemy had been struck. More often, there was nothing but silence, leaving men to wonder if they had achieved anything at all. Patience was required, though patience felt like torture. Below decks, life carried on in cramped darkness. Hammocks swayed, men tried to rest, but sleep came fitfully, haunted by the memory of flames on the water. In the mess, talk was scarce. A few muttered prayers before eating, others stared at tin plates without appetite. Yet still they ate, for hunger gave no reprieve. Cigarettes glowed faintly in cupped hands, their smoke curling into the air, a brief comfort against the gnawing cold. Above, the Arctic night pressed close. Snow fell lightly, clinging to coats and helmets, turning every man into a figure of frost. Boots slid on frozen decks, ropes stiffened like iron, and the endless sound of the sea filled every pause. The northern lights appeared again, shifting silently above, almost mocking in their beauty. Some men looked up in awe, others turned away, unwilling to find poetry in a sky that watched them suffer. Even in despair, though, discipline held. Orders were followed, routines maintained. The convoy was fragile, but its strength lay in unity, and every sailor understood it. Each man's endurance fed into the whole, each act of duty another thread holding the chain together. They knew the submarines would return. They always did. But for now the convoy pressed on, through dark seas and darker thoughts, bound by the simple determination to keep moving forward. Every mile gained was a small triumph, though it felt paid for with pieces of their souls. Morning brought no peace, only another kind of trial. The sea was calmer now, yet the cold cut deeper than ever. Frost coated every surface in a white crust, and sailors moved like shadows across decks glazed in ice. Their breath hung in the air, mingling with the smoke of funnels, while the endless horizon stretched in all directions. To the men, it felt as though they were sailing not across an ocean, but through a frozen wilderness with no end. Work continued regardless. Ice had to be chipped away, ropes checked, guns cleaned and engines tended. The repetition dulled the mind, yet it also kept despair at bay. Routine was survival. Even the smallest duties mattered, for a single neglected task could mean disaster when danger struck. In those hours, camaraderie showed itself in quiet ways. A sailor steadied a mate who slipped on the deck, another shared the last bite of a ration. These gestures, though small, carried weight. They reminded the men that they were not alone in their struggle. At meals, conversation grew slightly louder, stories told to distract from the fatigue. Some spoke of home, of meals warm and filling, of families waiting by firesides. Others told tales of earlier voyages, exaggerating hardships into humour, laughter rising for a brief moment before fading again. Sleep remained elusive. Hammocks creaked as ships rolled, and men turned restlessly beneath stiff blankets. Alarms interrupted what little rest they managed, jolting them back into cold corridors and onto icy decks. Fatigue dulled their thoughts, but not their instincts. A sudden shout, a strange noise, or the flicker of movement on the horizon could bring every man to alertness in an instant. That morning a signal was raised. Enemy aircraft reported nearby. The escort crews braced themselves, scanning the skies, eyes narrowed against the glare of snow and sea. Guns were loaded, watches doubled, voices sharp with command. The convoy tightened its line, every ship aware of the threat. Yet hours passed without attack. The planes never came. Relief spread quietly, though no one trusted it to last. In the Arctic, calm was never permanent. Beneath the brief silence, men carried an unspoken understanding. They were deep in hostile waters now, far from safety, closer to danger with each mile. What they faced was not yet the worst. That truth lingered in every look, every step, every beat of their hearts. The day wore on under a sky the colour of steel, low clouds pressing close, the light dim and cold. The convoy advanced in steady rhythm, merchant ships heaving through swells while the escorts prowled at the edges like vigilant sentinels. Every man aboard felt the weight of distance now. They were far from home, far from safety, and every mile carried them deeper into waters watched by the enemy. Yet outwardly life went on as routine. Deck watches changed with the precision of clockwork. Sailors marched to their guns for drills. Engineers tended engines that never rested. To an outsider it might have seemed ordinary, but for the men within it was survival shaped by repetition. Fatigue remained constant, a silent adversary as dangerous as frostbite or fire. Men rubbed their eyes, drank scalding tea, and forced themselves to remain alert. The thought of slipping even for a moment haunted them all. A torpedo could appear without warning, and the difference between life and death might depend on one sailor noticing a shadow a second sooner. In the quiet hours, memory pressed hardest. Photographs came out once again, edges worn soft, faces staring back from another world. Some men whispered the names of children or wives, as if repeating them aloud might keep them safe. Others spoke of simple things, streets, gardens, even the smell of rain, that felt impossibly distant beneath the Arctic sky. That evening a fresh alarm shattered the monotony. Lookouts spotted aircraft approaching from the west, dark shapes against the cloud cover. Guns swung upward, escorts shifted positions, and the convoy braced itself. But the planes never descended. Whether scouting or testing the defence, they turned away without striking. Still, the message was clear. They had been found again. Nerves tightened. Every man knew that discovery meant more attacks would follow. Night fell slowly, the horizon bleeding into black until sea and sky became indistinguishable. Covered lamps glowed faintly, ships moving like shadows bound together by duty. On deck, sailors stood wrapped in layers of frost, eyes scanning the darkness, ears straining against the endless wind. Beneath them, in the deep, U-boats prowled patiently, waiting for the chance to strike. The men couldn't see them, but they felt their presence, a pressure in the chest that never eased. And so they endured, gripping rails with frozen hands, whispering prayers into the cold. Each mile gained was both triumph and burden, a step closer to destination, and a reminder of how much further danger stretched ahead. Night in the Arctic could feel endless. Darkness pressed down heavy, broken only by the dim glow of hooded lamps and the ghostly shimmer of snow drifting across the decks. The convoy moved like a chain of shadows, each ship aware of the others by sound more than sight. To the sailor standing watch, It was a test of patience as much as endurance. Eyes strained for any flicker of movement, ears searched for the faint hiss of a torpedo's wake. Every creak of steel, every splash of water carried a hint of dread. Below decks, hammocks swayed, but sleep was shallow. Men lay awake, listening to the thrum of engines, knowing that at any moment alarms could tear them back into freezing air. In those hours, thoughts wandered most to home. Some men whispered prayers, others recited poems, still others clutched tokens, lockets, letters, or even scraps of cloth tied around wrists. These small things were shields against despair, fragile reminders that the world beyond the Arctic still existed. The escorts never rested. Destroyers zigzagged relentlessly, sonar pulses echoing into the deep. Each distorted return raised alarms, and depth charges thundered into the water, shaking the convoy with their force. Sometimes oil slicks or bubbles appeared, suggesting a kill. More often there was only silence, leaving men uncertain if the enemy had been destroyed or had simply slipped away. That uncertainty was its own torment. Dawn came slowly, pale light spreading across a sea that looked like hammered iron. The ships appeared one by one, grey silhouettes against the horizon, still together, still moving. Relief stirred among the men, though no one voiced it. They knew daylight brought another kind of danger. Aircraft could strike again, and without the cover of night the convoy was exposed. Yet even in the bleak morning beauty found its way in. The northern lights lingered faintly, green ribbons fading into dawn. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the hum of engines. For a moment, the world felt less hostile, as though reminding the men why they endured. Breakfast was served, hardtack, tea, sometimes porridge if supplies allowed. Conversation was minimal, but the simple act of eating together bound the sailors in quiet strength. They had survived another night, another chapter in the long ordeal. Ahead lay more perils, but for now the convoy held. And in that fragile unity, each man found enough hope to face the coming day. By mid-morning the calm broke again. Lookouts shouted warnings as aircraft reappeared, darker shapes against a pale sky. Engines roared across the waves and alarms rang throughout the convoy. Men dropped their mugs of tea, scrambled to stations and swung guns skyward. The escorts surged into new positions, forming a shield around the merchant ships. The first wave of bombers came low, skimming the water, sunlight flashing on wings before they released their loads. Explosions ripped through the sea, fountains of spray rising high. The convoy answered with a storm of fire. Tracers streaked upward, smoke and thunder filling the air. Sailors braced their legs against rolling decks, pulling triggers until shoulders ached. The air became a chaos of engines, gunfire, and shouted commands. One bomber caught fire, plunging into the ocean with a roar. Men cheered briefly, but more attackers followed, wave after wave. The sky seemed endless with threats. A merchant vessel took a hit amidships, fire blooming across her deck. Black smoke rolled out, choking the sky, as her crew fought to contain the flames. An escort darted to her side, guns still blazing, while hoses poured water over the inferno. The fight lasted minutes, though it felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it began, the bombers withdrew, vanishing back into the clouds. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of flames and the groan of strained steel. Damage control parties swarmed the wounded ship. Buckets and pumps worked furiously, and slowly the fire began to die. She was scarred, listing slightly, but she remained afloat. The convoy tightened its line and pressed forward, unwilling to abandon her. Below decks, men slumped in hammocks, too exhausted to speak. Some shook uncontrollably from the cold and nerves, others lay in silence, staring at steel above their heads. In the mess, conversation was scarce. A cigarette passed hand to hand, a shared glance across the table. These were the only comforts. Yet beneath the fatigue lay a quiet determination. They had endured another trial. The Arctic showed no mercy, nor did the enemy, but the convoy still lived. Each ship that remained was proof of resilience. Each mile gained another step closer to safety. The men did not cheer. They simply resumed their duties because they knew attacks would come again. In this frozen world, survival meant moving forward, always forward, no matter the cost. The day after the raid carried with it a heavy stillness. The sea rolled gently, as if mocking the terror that had passed only hours before. Smoke still lingered on the horizon where the damaged ship limped forward, her crew working tirelessly to keep her afloat. Sailors aboard other vessels glanced toward her often, silently willing her to hold on. They knew every ship mattered, not just for the supplies she carried, but for the proof that survival was still possible. Routine returned, though men moved slower, wearier. Guns were cleaned again, ammunition stacked neatly, hoses coiled in readiness for the next fire. Decks had to be cleared of ice, even while bruises from the last attack still ached. Duty gave no pause. In the mess, food was eaten in silence, mugs of tea cradled in hands too numb to feel their warmth. Some men spoke in low tones of the raid, replaying it detail by detail, as if speaking aloud might lessen its weight. Others refused to mention it at all, staring instead at photographs or letters tucked close to their hearts. Sleep was fitful. Nightmares replayed the roar of bombs, the sudden bloom of fire, the cries of men lost to the sea. When alarms sounded, some leapt from hammocks before they were even fully awake, bodies reacting faster than thought. It was exhaustion of both body and spirit, yet still they endured. Above deck, the Arctic revealed another face. The northern lights shimmered brighter than before, rippling green and violet curtains stretching across the black sky. Sailors stood in silence, staring upward, the glow reflected in weary eyes. For a few minutes, the world felt untouched by war, vast and mysterious. Some men whispered that the lights were a good omen, others kept their thoughts to themselves, unwilling to tempt fate. Beneath that beauty, however, danger remained. Sonar crews reported faint echoes in the deep, and destroyers dropped depth charges into the dark. The sea shook with thunder, geysers rising as men gripped rails and waited. No wreckage surfaced, no oil slick appeared. The submarines were still out there, unseen, patient. Every man felt their presence, like a shadow beneath the waves. Morning returned grey and cold, the convoy pushing on through swells that slapped against hulls with dull rhythm. Another day survived, another mile gained. The men carried on not because they believed the worst had passed, but because they had no choice. Survival meant moving forward, always into the frozen unknown. The further north the convoy pushed, the more the sea itself seemed determined to break them. Winds returned with sharp teeth, driving snow sideways across the decks, blinding men on watch. Waves grew higher again, slamming into hulls with a force that rattled steel and bone alike. Every step outside became a battle, boots slipping on ice, fingers stiff despite gloves, faces stung raw by salt and frost. Yet still the men worked. Axes rang out as ice was hacked from rails and gun mounts. Buckets of seawater froze solid before they could be tossed aside. On some ships, layers of ice grew so thick that entire crews were ordered onto decks to chip it away, hour after hour, until sweat froze on brows and muscles screamed with fatigue. To fall behind in this work was to risk the ship capsizing, and every sailor knew it. Inside, life was scarcely better. Quarters were damp, blankets stiff with frost, hammocks swaying in rhythm with the violent roll of the sea. Meals were rushed and plain, but they gave strength enough to continue. A man might cradle a tin mug of tea as though it were treasure, savouring each swallow before stepping back into the storm. Conversation remained minimal, broken by coughs or the creak of timbers. Still, there were sparks of humanity. A story shared, a song hummed under breath, even a single laugh cutting through the gloom. Such moments glowed briefly like sparks in darkness, fragile but necessary. The enemy was never forgotten. Every watch remained alert for periscopes, for the drone of engines overhead. The storm gave cover, but it also brought fear. Fear that submarines lurked closer, masked by the roar of wind and water. Escorts dropped depth charges at intervals. Explosions muffled by the storm meant as both defence and warning. Men counted them like heartbeats, each thunderous burst proof that someone was still watching. At night, the darkness grew absolute. Snow and cloud hid even the stars, leaving the convoy to crawl forward in near blindness. Lamps glowed faintly, shadows moving against a sea that felt endless. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, haunted by dreams of fire and drowning. Yet dawn always returned, grey and merciless, and with it another day of labour, another test of endurance. For the sailors, survival was no longer just a hope. It had become a discipline. Each breath, each step, each swing of an axe was part of the struggle against a world that seemed determined to erase them. And still, mile by mile, they pressed on. The storm finally eased, but it left the convoy scarred. Ships rolled heavily in calmer swells, their decks still crusted with frozen spray. Men looked older than their years, faces hollow, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Yet there was relief too, though no one spoke it aloud. The sea had spared them once again, and the line of vessels remained unbroken. The damaged merchant, patched and limping, still held her place in formation, a testament to stubborn determination. Routine returned quickly, for the Arctic allowed no pause. Guns were checked, ropes tightened, and the endless labour of chipping ice resumed. Men worked silently, breath hissing white in the air, tools clanging against steel. Every strike echoed their unspoken vow. As long as the ship floated, they would not yield. In the mess decks, conversation flickered back to life. A few jokes rose, cautious at first, then stronger. Someone pulled a harmonica from a pocket, its thin notes trembling but bright. For a few minutes the mess filled with something resembling warmth. The men clung to those moments, knowing they might be their last for days, or forever. At night the sea was calm, almost eerily so. Stars broke through clouds, scattered sharp across the black sky. The northern lights shimmered faintly, green curtains twisting in silence. Sailors leaned on rails, staring upward, their faces caught between awe and fatigue. Some whispered that such sights were gifts, reminders that beauty still existed even here. Others looked away, unable to reconcile wonder with the nearness of death. The quiet did not last. Sonar crews reported faint contacts again, echoes sliding through the headphones like whispers from the deep. Escorts surged forward, depth charges dropped in steady rhythm, explosions lighting the night. The convoy shuddered with each blast, men gripping rails, waiting for signs of success. None came. Only the restless sea remained, hiding whatever stalked them below. Morning returned with pale light. Smoke curled from funnels and the ships pressed on, bound tighter than ever. Every man aboard felt the weight of uncertainty, yet they also felt pride. Each day survived was proof of endurance, proof that they had not broken. The Arctic had thrown storms, cold and unseen enemies at them, and still they sailed. The journey was far from over, but for now the convoy remained whole. That fragile unity was its greatest strength, a chain that no storm or submarine had yet managed to break. The next phase of the journey carried the convoy deeper into hostile waters, where both the Arctic and the enemy pressed harder. The men felt it in their bones, a tension that grew heavier with every mile. The air seemed sharper, the sea darker, as though both conspired to remind them of how far from safety they had sailed. Escorts doubled their patrols, zigzagging endlessly, while lookouts searched the horizon with eyes that never truly rested. The memory of the last submarine attack lingered. Sailors spoke of it rarely, Yet no one forgot the sight of flames licking skyward, the cries of men carried away by wind and sea. Now every shadow on the water felt like a threat, every hollow echo from sonar a warning. Fatigue pressed deeper into the crew. Men nodded off at posts, jolting awake with guilty starts. Officers barked reminders, but most understood the lapses were not laziness, only the cost of weeks without real rest. The human body could endure much, but in the Arctic it was asked to endure more. Still, small acts of kindness persisted. A sailor handed over his last piece of chocolate, another gave up a blanket to a mate whose hammock hung closer to the draft. These gestures mattered more than speeches or orders. They reminded the men that even in the bleakest hours, humanity survived. That evening the convoy faced another air raid. It began with the low hum of engines, faint at first, then louder until the sky trembled. Alarms rang, and gunners swung weapons upward, shoulders stiff with cold and dread. Bombers swooped from the clouds, their silhouettes sharp against the pale light. The first bombs splashed wide, sending walls of water high over decks. The second run came closer. Too close. Explosions ripped through the sea, shattering the fragile calm. The convoy replied with fire, guns hammering, tracers clawing at the sky. One bomber fell, trailing smoke, but another released its load directly over a merchant ship. The blast tore into her stern, fire bursting outward in a roar that drowned the sea itself. Smoke boiled upward, black and choking. The stricken ship slowed, falling out of formation. Escorts raced to shield her, dropping smoke screens, their guns spitting defiance at the attackers. After long minutes, the bombers broke off, disappearing back into cloud. Silence followed again, heavier than before. The wounded ship still floated, but barely. Her crew fought flames with hoses and buckets, their silhouettes lit orange against the inferno. From nearby ships, sailors watched in grim silence, each man knowing that tomorrow it might be their turn, and yet the convoy pressed on, unwilling to leave her behind. Through the night, the damaged merchant fought for survival. Her crew worked without pause, passing buckets and chains, aiming hoses at flames that seemed endless. Sparks flew into the black sky, carried away by wind, while water froze as soon as it struck steel. Men's hands blistered, then split open, but they did not stop. Other ships could only watch, their own crews silent, prayers whispered into the cold. Escorts laid smoke to hide the convoy, guns pointed outward in case the enemy returned. Hours passed before the fire was finally beaten down, leaving the ship scarred and limping, yet still afloat. Dawn revealed the damage. Her stern was twisted, smoke still rising from blackened steel, but her flag remained. A cheer rippled through the convoy, muted but real. Survival in the Arctic was victory, no matter how small. Work resumed across the fleet. Ice had to be cleared, guns reloaded, wounds treated. In the mess, men spoke quietly of what they had seen, voices low, eyes distant. Some admitted they had expected to watch her sink. Others confessed envy of her crew's stubborn defiance. What united them all was respect. Respect for men who refused to surrender even when the sea and sky seemed joined against them. Yet danger never drifted far. Sonar crews reported faint contacts again, echoes slipping through the deep like whispers. Escorts surged forward, depth charges thundered, and the sea boiled with spray. Whether any submarine was struck, no one knew. Uncertainty was the cruelest companion, gnawing at nerves, robbing men of rest. That evening snow fell thick, cloaking the convoy in white. Visibility shrank to nothing, the world reduced to shadows and muffled engines. Sailors stood watch with ice crusting their coats, faces numb, eyes stinging. Some found the snow a blessing, hiding them from planes above. Others feared it gave cover to submarines lurking unseen. The debate remained unspoken. Every man carried his own truth. Below decks, fatigue settled deeper. Men slumped in hammocks, too weary to dream. Others scribbled notes in diaries, short entries marked with dates and little else. Words like storm, attack, still here filled the pages, each a record of survival. As night deepened, the convoy pressed forward, bound not by hope of safety but by necessity. The Arctic offered no comfort, only the certainty of more trials ahead. Yet each ship that still sailed was proof of endurance, each man aboard a thread in the fragile chain. They knew they had not yet faced the worst, but they also knew one truth. Together, they would keep moving. The convoy entered a stretch of sea sailors called the Killing Ground. Here the route hugged closer to the coast of occupied Norway, within range of enemy airfields and patrolled by U-boats lying in wait. Every man aboard knew this part of the journey carried the highest risk. Escorts shifted into tighter patterns, destroyers weaving across the formation like restless wolves, their crews straining to catch any sign of danger before it struck. For the merchant sailors, tension became a physical weight. They went about their duties silently, eyes fixed on the horizon, every creak of steel sounding like a warning. Even meals were different now, eaten quickly, voices hushed as though loud words might draw enemy fire. Some men took to carrying life belts constantly, unwilling to be caught unprepared. Others carved charms from wood or bone, tokens of luck in a sea where luck was rare. The attack came in late afternoon, when clouds thinned enough to let in pale light. Aircraft appeared first, a dark cluster on the horizon, engines droning like a storm on the wind. Alarms rang, men raced to stations, and guns swung skyward. Bombers swept in, releasing their loads in waves. Explosions tore through the sea, towering geysers of water drenching decks. Anti-aircraft fire answered, tracers streaking upward, the roar of cannons drowning voices. One bomber spiraled down in smoke, but another struck true, its bomb slamming into a merchant ship near the centre of the line. Fire burst outward, black smoke curling into the sky. Men scrambled across her decks, fighting the blaze as escorts closed around her. Meanwhile, U-boats seized their chance. Torpedoes sliced through the waves, white trails racing toward the convoy. A merchant ship shuddered, her hull split, water rushing in. She listed sharply, her crew struggling to launch lifeboats as the escorts roared past, dropping depth charges that shook the sea. The sky, the sea, and the convoy itself seemed to erupt in chaos all at once. For the sailors, it was terror beyond words, a storm of bombs, fire, and steel from above and below. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The bombers withdrew, the submarines vanished into the depths. 2 ships were gone, their places in the line forever empty. Survivors floated in lifeboats, faces pale, eyes hollow, as the convoy pressed on without pause. It was the cruel arithmetic of survival. To save the many, the few could not be lingered over. As night fell, the men returned to their stations, hands trembling, hearts heavy. They had entered the killing ground, and it had claimed its price. Night closed in after the chaos, and the convoy sailed on with 2 fewer ships. The gaps in formation were impossible to ignore. Where once there had been lights faintly visible through mist, now there was only darkness. Men on neighbouring vessels stared into that emptiness, the silence between them filled with memories of explosions, fire, and desperate cries. The Arctic had taken more lives, and every sailor knew it would demand still more before the voyage ended. Orders allowed no hesitation. Escorts resumed their patterns, destroyers cutting arcs across the sea, depth charges dropped in steady rhythm to keep submarines at bay. The sound of detonations rolled through the night, shaking the water, rattling teeth, and vibrating in the bones. To some it was reassurance, to others a grim reminder that death prowled just beneath them. On the merchant ships, sailors worked quietly to restore order. Fires had been beaten back, damage patched with steel plates and wooden beams. Men moved carefully on decks slick with ice, their breath hanging white in the cold air. Below, cargo was checked, engines maintained, every task performed as though nothing had changed. Routine was their only defence against despair. In the mess decks, conversation was subdued. A harmonica played softly, its thin notes barely heard above the rumble of engines. A few men sang along, voices tired but steady. Others stared at tin plates without appetite, hands trembling from cold or exhaustion. No one spoke of the dead. There was no need. Their absence filled every corner of the ship. Sleep offered no escape. Dreams were filled with fire and water, sudden alarms and the echo of explosions. Some men woke gasping, others shivered silently in hammocks, staring into darkness until duty called again. Yet the convoy moved forward. Dawn broke grey and bitter, the horizon a blur of snow and mist. The sea seemed quieter, though no one trusted it. Escorts prowled relentlessly, guns loaded, sonar crews alert. Every man knew another attack could come at any moment. Still, there were glimpses of beauty even here. The northern lights returned, brighter than before, ribbons of green and violet shimmering across the frozen sky. Sailors paused to watch, their faces caught between awe and sorrow. For a few minutes, the war felt distant. The Arctic transformed into something almost holy. Then the lights faded, and the cold crept in again. The convoy pressed on, battered but unbroken, each ship a fragile miracle against the vastness of sea and sky. The convoy pressed onward into waters where the danger never lifted, and though the sea appeared calm, every man aboard felt the weight of invisible eyes upon them. The Germans knew this route well. Aircraft patrols circled from bases in Norway, and U-boats coordinated like hunters stalking prey. Each day survived was an accomplishment, but it carried no promise of safety for the next. Sailors had grown quieter, their voices reserved only for orders or brief exchanges. Even jokes once whispered in the mess to ease nerves became rare. Fatigue sat heavily on shoulders, deepened lines on faces and dulled movements, yet discipline remained firm. The Arctic allowed no room for error. That morning, the first signs of trouble appeared in the form of signals passed from the escorts, submarines suspected close by. Destroyers surged ahead, sonar pings echoing into the deep. The sound was eerie, hollow, and each distorted return raised pulses. Suddenly a merchant ship near the rear shuddered violently. A torpedo had struck, lifting her bow with a roar, water rushing in as fire spilled across her deck. Alarms blared, men scrambled to lifeboats, and the convoy surged forward. An escort dropped smoke, while others dropped depth charges, the sea erupting with thunder. The stricken vessel sank quickly, her stern rising before sliding beneath the waves. Survivors rowed in small boats, their faces pale, hands stiff with cold. For a moment it seemed they would be left behind. Yet against orders, one escort slowed, risking itself to pull them aboard. The operation lasted minutes, but it felt like hours, the crew hauling men one by one from the freezing sea. Cheers rose briefly when the last survivor was safe on deck, but no one smiled for long. The ship was gone, her cargo lost, and every man knew the same fate could come for them at any moment. That night, silence weighed heavier than ever. Lamps glowed faintly, casting long shadows across decks. The northern lights flickered once more, eerie green reflections sliding across the ice-streaked water. Some sailors watched with awe, others refused to look, superstitious that the lights only appeared before tragedy. In the mess, men wrote short notes by dim light, folding them carefully, tucking them into pockets where they might never be read. Others sat with eyes closed, whispering prayers, their voices low and steady. Above them, the convoy continued its crawl through hostile waters. Every engine beat another defiance against sea and enemy alike. They pressed on not because hope was strong, but because stopping was not an option. The convoy entered another stretch of uneasy calm, the kind that carried more dread than relief. The sea lay flat, a mirror of steel beneath a low grey sky, and the silence felt unnatural. Lookouts stood stiff at their posts, scanning horizons that revealed nothing. Yet everyone knew the enemy was near. Calm seas made for clear skies, and clear skies brought aircraft. Sure enough, by midday the hum of engines reached them, faint at first, then swelling until the air itself seemed to vibrate. Alarms rang. Men ran to stations, boots pounding on frozen decks, guns swinging skyward. The first wave of bombers appeared through the clouds, black silhouettes growing larger. Anti-aircraft fire erupted instantly, tracers ripping into the sky, explosions thudding against the roar of engines. The bombers dived, releasing their loads in terrifying precision. One merchant ship was struck at the bow, fire surging upward as steel twisted. Another near miss sent a geyser of water drenching sailors, flinging men from their posts. Through it all, the convoy held formation. Escorts weaved to shield the line, their gunners firing until barrels smoked. A bomber fell in flames, plunging into the sea with a hiss, but others pressed on, circling, striking again. For nearly an hour the battle raged, noise and smoke blotting out the world. When the bombers finally turned away, silence returned heavy and cruel. 2 ships had been hit. One burned fiercely, her crew still fighting the blaze. The other listed badly, her stern dragging low in the water. Orders demanded the convoy continue, but escorts lingered, dropping smoke to cover the wounded. Sailors on nearby ships watched helplessly, their throats tight, as men on the stricken vessel scrambled for lifeboats. The sea swallowed her slowly, flames hissing out as icy water closed over her deck. Survivors rowed frantically, their faces hollow with shock. An escort darted in to recover them, even as the convoy crept forward. That night, the loss hung like a shadow. In the mess decks, no one spoke loudly. Tea was sipped in silence, bread eaten without taste. Some men sat with heads in hands, others stared blankly at steel walls. The photographs in their pockets seemed heavier, the distance from home more unbearable. Yet above deck the northern lights danced once more, bright and unearthly, shimmering across the frozen sky. Sailors paused to watch, breath catching in their throats. The world beyond war revealed itself briefly, achingly beautiful. Then the cold pressed in again, and duty called them back to their posts. The convoy sailed on, scarred but unbroken, towards seas where more trials surely waited. The convoy pushed deeper into the frozen seas, its numbers thinned, but its resolve unbroken. Each ship carried the weight of absence, empty spaces in formation, missing voices at meals, hammocks that would never again sway with familiar figures. Sailors avoided looking too long at those gaps, yet they felt them in every heartbeat. The Arctic was merciless, and the men knew the worst could still lie ahead. Escorts prowled constantly, their decks lined with watchful crews, eyes scanning the waves and skies. Destroyers darted outward, dropping depth charges in steady rhythms, their explosions booming like distant thunder. Sometimes oil slicks appeared, drifting on the surface, proof that an enemy had been struck. More often, the sea swallowed its secrets. Uncertainty gnawed at everyone. Was the threat gone, or waiting to strike again? Inside the ships, fatigue deepened. Men moved like shadows, faces pale and hollow, eyes red from lack of sleep. Food gave little comfort. Meals were rushed, flavourless, swallowed only because hunger demanded it. Some sailors muttered about dreams haunted by fire and water, waking with shouts that startled their mates. Others spoke less and less, retreating into silence as if words themselves had become too heavy to bear. Yet there were still sparks of life. A song hummed quietly, a story retold with a new twist, a cigarette shared on a frozen deck. These small gestures stitched the men together, fragile threads holding back despair. They had learned that courage was not found in grand speeches, but in the steady act of enduring another hour, another watch, Another mile. On one bitter evening, the aurora returned brighter than ever before, ribbons of green and violet rippling across the heavens. Men stood at rails, transfixed, their faces glowing in the otherworldly light. For a few moments the Arctic seemed less cruel, as though offering beauty in exchange for suffering. Some whispered that it was a sign, a promise they would reach their destination. Others feared it meant nothing at all. The night passed without attack, though no one slept soundly. Sonar crews listened for echoes, gunners kept hands on weapons, lookouts strained into the dark. The convoy pressed on, sails of smoke trailing into a sky that never seemed to brighten. Each day was a test of endurance, each night a gamble with fate. The men no longer asked when the voyage would end. They asked only if they would see its end. Still they sailed, because there was no other choice but forward. The convoy sailed deeper into enemy range, and every man felt it. Tension clung to the air as thick as the frost on railings. Each sunrise brought no relief, only the certainty that another test waited just beyond the horizon. Sailors stood their watches in silence, eyes darting across endless grey seas, ears tuned to the faintest drone of engines above or the subtle splash of water below. The Arctic had already claimed ships, but the men sensed the greatest danger still loomed ahead. That danger came at dusk, when the horizon glowed faintly red through snow clouds. Lookouts spotted aircraft, first a few, then a swarm, their dark silhouettes forming against the fading light. Alarms rang. Gunners ran to their stations, destroyers swung wide, and the convoy braced for impact. The first wave of bombers dove, engines howling, releasing their bombs in perfect arcs. Explosions tore through the water, geysers drenching decks, flames leaping skyward from near misses. The convoy answered with fury. Anti-aircraft fire lit the dusk, tracers stitching lines of fire across the sky. One bomber disintegrated in a burst of flame, plunging into the sea, but others pressed on, circling back for another run. A merchant ship caught a direct hit, her deck erupting in fire. Smoke poured into the sky, her crew scrambling to fight flames that threatened to consume her. Escorts rushed to shield her, guns thundering, while depth charges rolled into the sea to deter submarines that might be lurking nearby. For nearly an hour chaos reigned. The roar of engines, the thunder of guns, the cries of men fighting both fire and fear filled the frozen air. And then, as suddenly as they came, the bombers withdrew, vanishing into the storm clouds. The sea grew quiet again, but the silence carried only grief. The stricken ship still burned, her crew fighting desperately, but she began to list. Slowly, agonizingly, her bow rose, her stern slipped lower until the sea claimed her. Men in lifeboats rowed furiously, their breath steaming in the freezing air. Escorts moved in, pulling survivors aboard, while the rest of the convoy pressed onward. That night, the weight of loss sat heavy. In the mess deck, sailors ate in silence, spoons scraping against tin plates. A harmonica played a slow tune, fragile against the hum of engines. Some men stared at photographs until their eyes blurred. Others wrote letters they might never send. Above deck, the aurora shimmered once more, indifferent to grief. The convoy, smaller now, continued through the frozen sea, each man carrying the memory of fire, smoke, and silence. The convoy grew thinner still, yet it pressed on with grim determination. Each loss left a hollow place in formation, a gap sailors could not ignore, but necessity demanded they keep moving. The men no longer asked how many miles remained. They counted survival in hours, sometimes in minutes. Every watch was a test, every meal a reminder of those who would never eat again. Fatigue blurred days together, yet discipline kept the chain intact. The escorts, restless as ever, darted across the sea, their decks alive with watchful eyes and ready guns. Sonar crews leaned forward, straining to separate echoes from the deep. Every distorted return raised hearts to throats, Every burst of depth charges sent tremors through the steel hulls. Sometimes oil floated to the surface, proof of a victory. More often, the ocean revealed nothing, hiding its secrets in silence. Above, the threat of aircraft lingered. Men scanned the skies with narrowed eyes, waiting for the next swarm to descend. The Arctic had no mercy, and each clear sky felt less like beauty and more like danger. Still, amid dread, life continued. In the mess decks, voices rose in quiet conversation again. Some men spoke of home, gardens, children, wives waiting far away. Others clung to memories of ordinary things, a favourite street, the smell of bread, the sound of laughter in a pub. These details kept despair at bay, fragile threads connecting them to a world beyond ice and fire. On one evening, a sailor produced a deck of cards, worn and bent, and a game began under dim light. Laughter broke out briefly, startling in its warmth. For a moment, the war felt distant. Then alarms sounded, and cards scattered as men rushed to their stations. It was a false alarm, only shadows against clouds, but it reminded them how thin the line between calm and terror had become. Night stretched long, filled with the thrum of engines and the hiss of icy wind. The aurora flickered once more, faint this time, pale green against the black sky. Some men ignored it, too weary to care, while others watched silently, taking comfort in its beauty. Beneath that sky, the convoy pressed forward, scarred but unbroken. Every survivor carried the memory of fire and loss, but also the quiet pride of endurance. They had faced storms, submarines and bombers, and still they sailed. Ahead lay the final stretch, the promise of landfall. Yet none dared to hope too loudly. In the Arctic, hope was fragile, and the sea had not finished testing them. At last, after weeks of storms, attacks, and endless cold, the faint outline of land appeared on the horizon. At first it seemed a trick of the eye, a blur of grey against grey, but slowly it grew sharper. Hills rising from the mist, the distant shapes of buildings barely visible through snow. Murmansk. For the sailors, it was a sight as precious as treasure. Men crowded the rails, their faces gaunt but alive, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others simply stared in silence, too drained to speak. They had survived the worst journey in the world, and the knowledge settled over them like a weight finally lifted. The convoy, smaller than when it began, crept into harbour. Tugs moved out to guide them in, their horns echoing across the frozen bay. On shore, figures waved faintly, bundled in heavy coats, while cranes and docks waited for the cargo that had cost so much. Tanks, planes, ammunition, food, lifelines for the Eastern Front. Every ship that arrived was a victory, every crate unloaded proof that the sacrifice had meaning. Yet the men felt no triumph, only exhaustion. They moved slowly, their bodies battered, their hands scarred from ice and fire. Some collapsed in hammocks and slept for the first time in weeks without fear of alarms. Others wrote hurried letters home, words scratched onto paper with trembling hands. Still alive, reached port, thinking of you. There was no boasting, only gratitude for breath, for warmth, for survival. Still, memory lingered. Empty places in formation haunted them, the faces of men lost to sea and flame etched forever into their minds. No celebration could erase the cost, and yet beneath the grief there was pride. Pride in endurance, pride in duty, pride in having carried their burden across a world determined to stop them. They had stood against storms, submarines and bombers, and though the Arctic had taken its toll, it had not broken them. As night fell over Murmansk, the northern lights shimmered once more above the harbour, bright ribbons of green and violet sweeping across the frozen sky. Sailors paused to watch, breath rising in the cold air, hearts caught between sorrow and wonder. Perhaps it was only nature's show, indifferent to human struggle. But to the men who had endured, it felt like something more, like a quiet salute from the heavens, a recognition of their journey. The Arctic convoys would be remembered as lifelines of war, but for those who sailed them, they were more than history. They were nights of terror, days of endless toil, and moments of fragile beauty. Above all, they were proof of human endurance in a world that tried to erase it.